right, so today we're diving into something that hits close to home for a lot of folks, especially here in California. Just cause eviction laws.
Yeah.
You know, whether you're renting, thinking about renting, or maybe you just want to know how this whole system works.
Yeah.
This deep dive is for you.
It's wild how this whole concept of just cause eviction is kind of blowing up, not just in California, but all over the U.S.
Right.
It really flips the script on how landlords and tenants interact, you know?
Totally. So before we get too far, I think it's good to set the stage right.
Sure.
What exactly is just cause eviction?
Okay, so basically it means a landlord can't just boot you out for any random reason. They need a solid legal reason.
Okay.
A just cause. Could be stuff like not paying rent, violating the lease terms, causing damage.
So it's like a safety net for renters to keep them from getting the boot unfairly.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those situations where the tenant isn't really at fault? What if the landlord wants to sell or move a family member in?
Yeah, those are really good questions. And that's where California's Tenant Protection Act comes in, a.k.a. AB 1482.
Oh, yeah, AB 1482. That's the one everyone's talking about.
Right.
I've seen it in the news, read about it, but honestly, it all sounded kind of like legal mumbo-jumbo to me.
Right.
Can you break it down so normal people can understand?
For sure. One of the biggies in AB 1482 is rent control. It basically puts a limit on how much landlords can hike up the rent each year.
So no more landlords just randomly doubling the rent because they feel like it?
Pretty much. There's a formula they got to follow. Can't be more than 5% plus the consumer price index, but the total increase can't ever be more than 10% a year.
Gotcha. Okay, so if my rent is, let's say, $1,000 a month and the CPI is 3%, the most my landlord could raise it is $1,080.
You got it. The whole point is to make rent increases predictable so tenants can actually budget and, survive.
Especially in California where the cost of living is already kind of crazy.
Totally.
But hang on a sec. I've heard that AB 1482 doesn't cover all properties.
Yeah.
There are exceptions, right?
Yeah, there are. Single-family homes and condos are usually exempt as long as they're not owned by a big corporation or some types of LLCs.
So there are loopholes.
Yeah.
This is where it gets tricky for renters, right? Knowing what applies and what doesn't.
Yeah, it can be. And here's where it gets interesting. There's this thing called the 15-year rule.
Okay.
If a building is less than 15 years old, you might think it automatically dodges AB 1482.
Right.
But that's not always true.
Really? So you could live in a brand new building and still be protected by AB 1482?
Yeah.
That seems kind of backwards.
It does, right? But here's the catch. Even if the building is new, the landlord has to give tenants a specific document called the Rent Cap Just Cause Addendum. It basically says AB 1482 doesn't apply to that unit.
So if a building has a bunch of units and it's older than 15 years, it's pretty much guaranteed to be under AB 1482.
Yeah.
But even if it's newer, renters should keep an eye out for this addendum.
Exactly.
If they haven't gotten it, AB 1482 might still be in play.
Yep. It's a tiny detail that can make a big difference.
This is already making my head spin.
Right.
There's a lot more to these just cause eviction laws than I realized. We touched on those no-fault evictions earlier. What exactly counts as a just cause for eviction under AB 1482?
Okay, so some common ones are not paying rent, violating lease terms, damaging the property, or doing illegal stuff in the unit.
Okay, those are pretty straightforward. But what about those situations where, the landlord wants to move a family member in?
Yeah, those get a bit trickier. And that's where SB 567 enters the picture.
Okay.
This bill kind of tagged on to AB 1482 and made things way stricter for those owner-family move-in evictions.
So SB 567 is AB 1482's tough older sibling.
You could say that before SB 567, landlords could evict tenants for this reason, with a 60-day notice and some relocation help. Now it's a whole different ballgame.
Okay, I'm all ears. Imagine I'm a tenant and my landlord suddenly wants their cousin to move in. What do they have to do now?
First off, they have to put it in writing, who this person is, how they're related to them, and you as the tenant can totally ask for proof.
So no more vague stories about some distant relative they want to move in.
Nope. It's got to be legit.
That's a big change. Seems like SB 567 is trying to stop landlords from abusing this exception.
Exactly. And there's another important thing. The owner or family member actually has to move into the unit within 90 days of the tenant leaving and stay there for at least a year.
Hold up. So if the landlord's cousin bails after a few months, the original tenant could actually move back in at their old rent.
You bet.
Yeah.
It's all about making sure landlords aren't using this exemption to dodge rent control or just kick out tenants unfairly.
Wow, SB 567 is really shaking things up.
Oh.
I can see why this is such a hot topic, especially in California.
Yeah, and we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack, like those substantial remodel evictions landlords use sometimes.
Oh yeah, I've heard about those. It's like, sorry, got the whole everyone, but then they just like repaint and double the rent. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. And guess what? SB 567 throws a wrench in that plan, too.
Okay, spill the tea. Before SB 567, landlords could basically spring these remodel evictions on tenants with barely any notice. But now they need to have all their permits ready to go before they even give a notice.
No more surprise renovations.
Nope. And they can't be vague about it either. The notice has to spell out exactly what they're doing, plus show those permits. And just like with the family move-in thing, there's a catch. If the remodel doesn't actually happen or it's all a sham, guess what? The tenant can move back in at their original rent.
Wow, SB 567 is really giving tenants more power. But what about actually enforcing these laws? In the past, it felt like these laws were just kind of like suggestions. Hard for tenants to actually use them to protect themselves.
That's a good point. And that's another area where SB 567 really stepped up. It made the penalties for landlords who break the rules way harsher.
So it's not just about having the laws written down, it's about making sure they actually work.
Right before SB 567, tenants could only really use AB 1482 violations as a defense if they were getting evicted. But now they can actually sue their landlord for damages if the landlord breaks the law.
So like if a landlord tries to illegally evict someone or jacks up the rent beyond the limit, the tenant can take them to court and maybe even get some money back.
Exactly. It's a big change that gives tenants a way to fight back against unfair stuff.
This is all really important info for anyone renting or thinking about renting in California.
Yeah, for sure.
It can be super confusing trying to figure it all out.
Definitely.
And speaking of figuring things out,
Yeah.
you're actually from the Martinez Law Center, a law firm that specializes in representing tenants in California, right?
Oh, that's right.
So if any of our listeners are renters and they feel like something shady is going on with their landlord, they could reach out to you guys.
Absolutely. We're all about fighting for tenant rights and making sure everyone has a safe place to live.
That's awesome. We'll be sure to share their website, martinezlawcenter.com, in the show notes for anyone who wants to learn more.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we've covered the basics of just cause eviction in California.
Yeah.
We dug into AB 1482 and all its little twists and turns. And we even talked about how to make sure those laws actually get enforced.
Yeah, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole world out there when it comes to tenant rights.
Exactly. Stay tuned for part 2, where we're going to zoom out and see how other countries are dealing with this whole no-fault eviction thing.
Yeah, it's going to get global.
Get ready for a worldwide tour of tenant rights.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into just cause eviction laws.
Yeah.
So we've been talking about how things work here in California.
Right.
But now I want to broaden our horizons a bit.
Okay.
And see how other countries are tackling this whole issue.
I'm really curious about that. It's kind of crazy to think about how this concept of just cause eviction is like taking root in different parts of the world.
Yeah.
And changing things up. So where are we headed first on this global tour?
Let's hop across the pond to the UK.
Okay.
England and Wales specifically. They've had a system that until recently actually allowed no-fault evictions.
Wait, really? No-fault evictions were a thing in the UK. That's wild. After all the stuff we talked about in California, it's like a whole different world.
I know, right? For a long time, landlords in England and Wales could use this thing called a Section 21 notice to evict tenants without giving any reason at all.
So like a tenant could be paying their rent on time, taking care of the place, being a model citizen.
Yeah.
And still get kicked out just because.
Pretty much. It gave landlords a lot of power to end tenancies, often with just a couple months' notice.
That sounds super stressful. Like imagine trying to build a life somewhere knowing you could be uprooted at any moment.
It was definitely a source of anxiety for renters. They never knew if they'd be able to stay in their homes long term.
That's rough. But it sounds like things might be changing over there.
You're right. Things are definitely shifting. In 2023, the UK government introduced the Renters Reform Bill, which would ban no-fault evictions in England and Wales.
A complete ban. That's a big deal.
It is. It shows they're serious about protecting tenants.
So what led to this big change in policy?
Well, there was this growing feeling that the old system was unfair. It gave landlords too much power over tenants. That Section 21 notice was basically a way for landlords to evict people without having to prove anything.
That makes sense. So if this bill passes, what will evictions look like in the UK?
If the Renters Reform Bill goes through, landlords won't be able to use those Section 21 notices anymore.
Okay.
They'll have to show they have a valid reason for evicting someone. Could be stuff like unpaid rent, property damage, antisocial behavior, or if they need to sell the property.
So no more evicting someone just because you feel like it.
Nope. Landlords will have to have a just cause, just like we talked about in California.
It's pretty amazing how this whole idea is spreading around the world.
Yeah.
Are there any other international examples that stand out?
Definitely. While the UK's move is pretty dramatic, other countries have had some form of just cause eviction protections for a long time, like Germany.
Oop.
They have really strong tenant rights. It's super hard for landlords to evict tenants without a really good reason.
So it's not like this is a brand new concept.
Nope.
Other countries have been doing this for years, and it seems to be working.
Exactly. It shows that it's totally possible to have a rental market that's fair to both landlords and tenants.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, it's not about making landlords the bad guys or stopping them from managing their properties.
Right.
It's about making sure tenants have some basic protection.
Right. It makes you wonder what the future holds.
Yeah.
Like with all these just cause eviction laws popping up in the U.S. and other countries, do you think this could become the norm everywhere?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely clear that more and more people are recognizing the importance of tenant rights.
And it's not just happening at the national level, right? Like a lot of cities here in the U.S. are also passing their own just cause eviction laws.
Yeah, that's right. Local governments are often on the front lines of housing policy.
Yeah.
They're closer to the people they represent and can respond more quickly to the needs of their communities.
So even if a state doesn't have strong tenant protections, cities can step up and fill the gap.
Exactly. It's a great example of how grassroots activism can really drive change.
It's like this multi-layered puzzle with all these different pieces fitting together: state laws, federal programs, city ordinances, and even international trends.
It's a complex system, for sure. And one of the key takeaways here is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
What works in one place might not work in another. And as society changes and the economy changes, so do the laws around housing.
It's like this ongoing dance between the rights of landlords and the rights of tenants.
Yeah.
And policymakers are trying to find that sweet spot where everyone's treated fairly.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Finding that balance is super important for creating a housing market that works for everyone.
Okay, so we've talked about California. We've looked at what's happening in the UK. We've even touched on the global picture of tenant rights.
Yeah.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle I want to talk about.
Okay.
The impact of federal programs on tenant rights.
Oh, yeah. Good point. Federal programs play a huge role, especially for people who live in affordable housing.
And this is where things get even more complicated, right?
Yeah.
Because federal rules can sometimes overlap with state and local laws. It's like a legal maze.
Totally. One big example is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, or LIHTC for short.
Okay.
It basically gives developers incentives to build and maintain affordable housing. But it also comes with its own set of just cause eviction rules.
So even if a state doesn't have strong tenant protections on its own,
Right.
tenants in LIHTC properties might still have some safeguards in place.
Exactly. It's like an extra layer of security, especially for people who rely on affordable housing programs.
This is so important for people to understand.
Yeah.
It's not just about knowing your rights as a tenant in general. It's about knowing what protections apply to your specific situation.
Exactly. And this is where things can get really tricky. The definition of just cause can actually be different depending on the program, the state, and even the city.
So like if I'm living in an LIHTC apartment building,
Yeah.
where do I even start trying to figure out my rights?
That's a good question. A good place to start is by contacting the agency that runs the LIHTC program in your state or city.
Okay.
You can also reach out to tenant advocacy groups or legal aid services.
And if it all feels too overwhelming, it's probably a good idea to talk to a lawyer who specializes in tenant rights.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Especially if you're facing a possible eviction, having a lawyer on your side can make a huge difference.
Right, because they know all the ins and outs of the law.
Exactly. And speaking of lawyers who fight for tenant rights, we've mentioned Martinez Law Center a couple times already.
Right.
They're a law firm here in Southern California that specializes in representing tenants. They know California tenant law inside and out, and they've helped a ton of people fight for their rights.
So if any of our listeners are in California and they're having problems with their landlord,
Yeah.
Martinez Law Center might be a good resource for them.
Definitely. They also have a really helpful website, martinezlawcenter.com, where you can find more info and learn about your rights as a tenant.
Awesome. It's so important to have resources like that available, especially in a place like California where the housing market can be so tough.
Totally.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this episode. We talked about just cause eviction in California. We looked at what's happening internationally, and we even dived into the world of federal housing programs.
Yeah, we've been all over the map.
But before we wrap things up, I think it's important to remember that this isn't just about laws and regulations.
Right.
This is about people's lives.
Absolutely. Housing is a basic human need, and everyone deserves to have a safe and stable place to live.
And these laws and programs we've been talking about,
Yeah,
they're designed to help make that happen.
exactly. So as we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay, I'm listening.
As these tenant protection laws become more common in the U.S. and around the world, what do you think the long-term effects will be on the housing market?
That's a really interesting question. Like, will it make housing more affordable and stable for renters? Or could it have some unintended consequences?
That's a tough one to answer. It's a really complex issue with no easy solutions.
Definitely. But I think it's important to keep asking these questions.
Right.
To keep learning and trying to understand these issues so we can create a housing system that works for everyone.
Well said. All right, everyone, stay tuned for part 3 where we'll bring it all together and give you some practical tips and advice.
It's going to be good.
Welcome back, everyone. It's been quite a journey exploring this world of just cause eviction laws.
It really has.
We've gone from California all the way to the UK and back again.
Yeah, a whirlwind tour of tenant rights.
Exactly. So now I think it's time to kind of take a step back,
Okay.
connect all the dots and see what we've learned.
Yeah, sounds good.
If there's like one big takeaway from this whole deep dive, what would it be?
I think it's that knowledge is power, especially when it comes to your rights as a tenant or a landlord.
Right, because if you don't know the rules of the game,
Yeah.
how can you play it?
And as we've seen, those rules can change depending on where you are, what type of property you're dealing with, even what kind of federal programs might be involved.
That's a lot to keep track of.
It really is.
Yeah.
So let's recap a bit. We started in California talking about AB 1482, that big Tenant Protection Act.
Right, rent control, just cause for evictions, big
Right.
changes.
Big changes. And then we had SB 567 coming in, making things even stricter for landlords.
Especially for those owner move-in evictions and those big remodel situations.
It's amazing how those little details like that addendum we talked about can have such a huge impact.
It's all about the fine print.
It really is. It shows how important it is to read everything carefully and know what questions to ask.
For sure. And the thing is, it's not just California. This whole idea of protecting tenants is catching on all over the world.
Right, like we talked about the UK and their move to ban no-fault evictions completely.
Yeah, that was a big one.
It seems like people are starting to realize that housing is more than just a business.
It's a basic human right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everyone deserves a safe and stable place to call home.
And that's where those federal programs we talked about come in.
Right, like the low-income housing tax credit.
Yeah, they can provide an extra layer of protection for renters, especially those who are most vulnerable.
It's like we're putting together this giant puzzle, right?
Yeah, a puzzle with a lot of pieces.
State laws, federal programs, local ordinances, international trends. It's a lot.
And sometimes you need a little help to put it all together.
Absolutely. So if any of our listeners out there are feeling lost or overwhelmed,
Yeah.
don't be afraid to reach out for help. There are organizations and law firms that specialize in tenant rights.
They can be a lifeline in those tough situations.
Speaking of which, we've mentioned Martinez Law Center a few times during this deep dive.
Yeah, great folks over there.
They're a law firm in Southern California that focuses on helping tenants.
They know all the ins and outs of California tenant law.
And they have a website, martinezlawcenter.com, where you can find tons of information and resources.
Super helpful.
Okay, so as we wrap things up here, I think it's important to remember that this conversation goes beyond just laws and policies.
Right. At the end of the day, it's about people.
Exactly. Real people's lives are affected by these issues.
So true. So as we come to the end of our deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
As these tenant protection laws become more common, what impact do you think they'll have on the housing market as a whole?
That's a great question. Will it make housing more affordable? Will it create more stability for renters? Or will it lead to some unintended consequences?
It's something we all need to think about and keep an eye on.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Definitely.
But I think the important thing is to keep having these conversations,
Yes.
to keep learning and trying to understand these issues so we can create a housing system that works for everyone.
Well said.
So on that note, we want to thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into just cause eviction laws. We hope you've learned something new, gained a fresh perspective, and maybe even feel a little more empowered to navigate this crazy world of housing.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.